listeners, and welcome back. Today we are going to continue our exploration through New Hampshire's history. Last time we talked about the native tribes who were here first and the first Europeans to reach our shore. Today we're going to look at the Revolutionary War, all the way up to the Civil War, and how that impacted our great state of New Hampshire. Let's get started. New Hampshire history, colonial times. New Hampshire had been under a royal province since 1680. Under that structure, England appointed the state's governor. However, the people of New Hampshire elected their own assemblymen. By 1767, New Hampshire had a population of almost 53,000. The actions of England during the 1760s and 1770s brought the colonies closer and closer to a confrontation with England. New Hampshire stood firmly behind the leaders who wanted to revolt against England. In December 1774, shortly before the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Paul Revere rode to New Hampshire to warn the people that the English were increasing their military power in Massachusetts. Several months later, the battles of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts were fought and the Revolutionary War was in full swing. New Hampshire militia forces were immediately involved in the Battle of Bunker Hill. New Hampshire contributed to several regiments of troops and 2 generals to the Continental Army. However, there was never any actual combat in the state, meaning no Revolutionary War battles were actually fought in our state. Post-Revolution. After the Revolutionary War, New Hampshire grew like many New England states. Portsmouth became a major clipper ship port, sending cargo all over the world. New Hampshire's soil was poor and rocky, but it continued to be a largely agricultural state until the Civil War. Nearly 3/4 of its population worked on farms at the time. New industry started slowly. By the 1850s, textile factories had begun to appear in small New Hampshire towns. Factories needed steady power, and there weren't many sources of power at that time. But rivers could be harnessed to provide that power, and New Hampshire had many rivers to be put to use. In this period, New Hampshire contributed a great statesman and orator, Daniel Webster, to the country. He was born in New Hampshire and served his first terms in Congress as a representative from New Hampshire. In 1816, he moved to Massachusetts, where he became a senator. Daniel Webster's greatest cause was the Union. This was a difficult time in history. Differences between the slave and free states threatened to tear the country apart. Webster tried not to let that happen. His rallying cry was liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. However, Webster was a Northerner, and many Northerners were firmly against slavery. They wanted to preserve the Union, but did not think it was right to compromise on slavery. So we're going to see a little video about the Civil War, and then we're going to read a little bit more about it and answer some questions. Let's check out A Kid Explains History.
A Kid Explains History. Hey everyone, Mr. Q here. This is the first episode of 2017. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Wherever you celebrate. Today's topic has been requested by a lot of you. Thanks for doing that, by the way. Keep requesting stuff. We're gonna do it. Just putting it out there. Time to get into the video.
Civil War? Let's do this. There's been lots of civil wars throughout history. That's when one part of a country fights another part of the country instead of a whole nother country. England's done this a few times. China had a big one. And there's one going on in Syria right now, which is actually a really sad situation. But we're going to talk about the one that happened in America. Now, the United States was founded 240 years ago with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But you could argue that the moment that we really became a nation is 151 years ago. That's when we decided not to break up into 2 different countries. But why did people even want to do that in the first place? In a word, slavery. Let's look at some background. For hundreds of years, Africans were kidnapped and shipped to America to work in the fields. States in the South had agricultural economies, which is another way of saying they made money from farms. A lot of them thought it was their God-given right to keep slaves. States in the North had industrial economies, which means that they make stuff in factories with machines. During the 1840s and the 1850s, people kept moving west and created new territories to live in. A lot of these territories wanted to become new states. A compromise was reached between the North and the South, saying that any new state could join the Union if they didn't have slavery. Which brings us to the presidential election of 1860. A new political party called the Republicans ran on an anti-slavery platform. Their nominee was Abraham Lincoln. The South didn't like it when he won. A bunch of states left the Union, elected their own president called Jefferson Davis, called themselves the Confederate States of America, and even printed their own money. The war started when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter, and everyone had to pick a side. Battles raged for years. In 1863, Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, and lots of African Americans were allowed to join the army in the North. Most people agree that the tide turned with the Battle of Gettysburg, and within 2 more years, the North had won. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865. Slavery was no more, and the United States was preserved. All in all, 2% of all of America died in the Civil War, which would be the equivalent of 6 million people today. Unfortunately, one of the last people to die was Abraham Lincoln himself. He was shot by a Confederate sympathizer just 5 days after the South surrendered. Even though the Civil War resolved a lot of things, that sure didn't stop Americans disagreeing with each other. But there's a lot of really good things about America, which makes me glad that the Civil War ended the way it did. Thanks for watching, everyone. I love reading your comments, So,
the Civil War, again, is whenever one country fights itself. So let's take a look at the Battle of Gettysburg, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So here we have an image of Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1863, Southern and Northern troops clashed in one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. After the Confederate or Southern Army won the battle in Northern Virginia, it invaded the North and headed into Pennsylvania. It hoped to collect more supplies and weaken the North. Meanwhile, the Union Army of the North was pursuing the Confederate troops. The two sides met and fought near the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The battle at Gettysburg has been called the most crucial battle in American history. Before the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederacy had been doing very well in the Civil War. But at Gettysburg, the North defeated the South. The battle was bloody. The Union Army suffered 23,000 casualties, while the Confederate Army suffered 28,000. A casualty is when someone is killed, wounded, or captured in battle. The Battle of Gettysburg turned the tide of the war and marked the beginning of the success of the North in defeating the South. In the fall of 1863, President Lincoln visited the battle at Gettysburg for a ceremony dedicating the field to all the soldiers who had died. He reminded people why Americans must stand up for their values. His speech, the Gettysburg Address, has become one of the most famous speeches of American history. Lincoln said, "67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the idea that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Lincoln's words were never forgotten. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people remains. Today, we are going to complete a Google form with questions about our reading passage. Of course, we're going to put our name. First question. Why has the Battle of Gettysburg been called the most crucial battle in American history? It was a turning point in the Civil War. It was the first time the North was invaded. It was the bloodiest battle in American history. Next question. The passage sequences the events that led up to the Gettysburg Address. Which of the following happened first? The Confederate Army invaded the North and headed into Pennsylvania. President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. The Confederate Army won a battle in Northern Virginia. The Gettysburg Address shows Lincoln's determination to have a unified country once more. What sentence from the speech best supports this conclusion? It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Next question. Based on Lincoln's speech, how can the men who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg best be honored? By creating a whole new government that includes the North and South. By consecrating the battlefield on which the soldiers fought. By working to unite the American nation once more. What is the passage Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address mostly about? The casualties suffered by the Union and Confederate armies. An important Civil War battle and Lincoln's address. How the Battle of Gettysburg impacted the tide of the Civil War. What is the purpose of the paragraphs provided before the text of the Gettysburg Address? To examine the dedication of the battlefield, to criticize Lincoln's speech, to provide historical context for the address. Down to our last two. Choose the answer that best completes the sentence below. In the summer of 1863, the Confederate Army of the South invaded the North blank. It hoped to collect more supplies and weaken the North. Which word goes in? However, because, although. Last question. How did the Battle of Gettysburg impact the outcome of the Civil War? It marked the beginning of the success of the North defeating the South. It showed that Abraham Lincoln was a great president. It marked the biggest battle in American history. All right, fourth graders, please make sure that you complete your Google form. Next time I see you, we will continue on with some New Hampshire history. We will see a little bit about New Hampshire today, and we will work on our slideshows. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.